Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we follow the complete story of Alleria Windrunner, eldest of the Windrunner sisters, from her life as a high elven ranger in Quel'Thalas to becoming the first mortal ever to master the powers of the void. In the annals of Warcraft history, few characters have undergone such a remarkable transformation as Alleria Windrunner. She began her story as a high elven ranger, dedicated to protecting her homeland from the threats that lurked beyond its magical borders. She will end her story, whenever that ending comes, as something far different, a being touched by cosmic forces that most mortals cannot even comprehend. Between those 2 points lies a tale of love and loss, of vengeance and redemption, of choices made in impossible circumstances and consequences that echoed across centuries. Alleria's importance extends beyond her role in the game's story. She represents something fundamental about the Warcraft universe itself, the idea that heroes are not born, but made through the trials they endure and the choices they make. She was not destined for greatness in the way that some characters seem to be. She chose it again and again at every crossroads in her journey, and those choices cost her dearly, cost her years with her son, cost her connection to her homeland, cost her the simple life she might have lived if she had been content to stay within the borders of Quel'Thalas. The story of Alleria Windrunner begins in the golden forests of Quel'Thalas, the ancient kingdom of the High Elves, where the Windrunner family had served as protectors for generations beyond counting. The Windrunners were not merely another noble house among the Ren'dorei aristocracy. They were the guardians of the kingdom itself, the first line of defense against any who would threaten the eternal spring that blessed those magical lands. Their name carried weight that few other families could claim, and their dedication to Quel'Thalas was matched only by their skill with bow and blade. Larissa Windrunner held the title of Ranger General of Silvermoon, the highest military honor that could be bestowed upon any elf in the kingdom. She commanded the Farstriders, the elite ranger corps that patrolled the borders of Quel'Thalas and ventured into the wilds beyond. Her skill with a bow was legendary, her tactical mind unmatched, and her devotion to her people absolute. Those who served under her spoke of a leader who demanded excellence but led by example, who would never ask of her rangers what she would not do herself. The Farstriders themselves were more than just soldiers. They were the eyes and ears of Quel'Thalas, the first warning against any threat that might approach the kingdom's borders. They could track a single leaf falling in a forest from miles away, could move through the woods without disturbing a single branch, could loose an arrow with enough precision to split another arrow already embedded in a target. Larissa had trained each of them personally, had shaped the Farstriders into the finest military unit that the High Elves possessed, and she was proud of what they had accomplished under her leadership. Her reputation extended far beyond the borders of Quel'Thalas. In the ancient days of the Troll Wars, when the Amani Empire had threatened to overwhelm the High Elven Kingdom, it was the Farstriders who had held the line while alliances were forged with the human kingdoms. Larissa's predecessors had fought alongside human warriors, had learned to respect the shorter-lived races for their courage and determination. Those alliances had saved Quel'Thalas from destruction, though in the centuries since, the High Elves had retreated into isolation, preferring the comfort of their magical kingdom to the complexities of dealing with outsiders. Her husband, Vareth Windrunner, served in a different capacity, but with no less distinction. As chief advisor to King Anasterion, Sunstrider, he moved through the halls of power with the same grace that his wife moved through the forests. Where Larissa defended the kingdom's borders with arrows and blades, Vareth defended its interests with words and wisdom. Together, they represented the pinnacle of high elven society, a union of martial prowess and political acumen that made the Windrunner name synonymous with service to Quel'Thalas. Into this legacy of duty and honor, 4 children were born. The eldest was named Alleria, after her maternal grandmother, a ranger of considerable renown in her own time. From her first breath, expectations surrounded her like the golden light that filtered through the leaves of Eversong Woods. As the firstborn daughter of the Ranger General, Alleria was destined to follow in her mother's footsteps. The title of Ranger General would pass to her when Larissa's time came to an end, and Alleria would carry on the Windrunner tradition of protecting Quel'Thalas from all threats. After Alleria came Sylvanas, the middle daughter, who even from childhood showed the combination of skill and charisma that would one day make her a legend in her own right. Where Alleria questioned and challenged, Sylvanas embraced and excelled. She took to the ways of the ranger with a natural aptitude that impressed even their exacting mother. The bond between the 2 eldest sisters was complicated from the start, shaped by the shadow of expectation that fell heavier on Alleria's shoulders. Then came Varissa, the youngest daughter, whose gentle nature sometimes seemed at odds with the warrior traditions of her family. She possessed the same skill with a bow that ran in Windrunner blood, but there was a softness to her that her elder sisters had hardened against. She would often serve as the bridge between Alleria's rebelliousness and Sylvanas's dedication, trying to maintain peace within a family that valued strength above all else. And finally, there was Lirith, the only son, the youngest of the Windrunner children. Unlike his sisters, Lirith did not inherit the physical prowess that defined the family name. He was slight of build, ill-suited for the rigors of ranger life, but blessed with a voice that could bring tears to the eyes of even the most hardened warrior. His talents lay in music and song, and while some might have seen this as a departure from Windrunner tradition, his family loved him no less for it. He was particularly close to Sylvanas, who doted on her younger brother despite their occasional bickering. The Windrunner estate in Eversong Woods was a place of beauty and training where the children learned the skills they would need to serve their people. Alleria excelled in her studies, mastering the bow before she reached her 100th year, learning to track and hunt and fight with the proficiency that was expected of a future ranger general. But even as she met every standard set before her, there was something in her that refused to simply accept the path that had been chosen for her. From a young age, Alleria showed a curiosity about the world beyond the borders of Quel'Thalas that troubled her mother. The High Elves had long maintained a policy of isolation, withdrawing from the affairs of other races after the Troll Wars had been won. They saw little need to engage with the shorter-lived humans or the scattered dwarves, content in their magical kingdom where the Sunwell provided all they required. This isolationism was not merely policy, but philosophy, a belief that the High Elves had achieved a level of civilization that others could not match and had nothing to gain from interaction with lesser peoples. Alleria did not share this view. She read the histories of the Troll Wars with particular interest, not for the tales of elven heroism, but for the accounts of human allies who had fought alongside her ancestors. The humans had proved themselves valuable partners in that ancient conflict, had bled and died to help protect a people not their own. And yet, once the war was won, the High Elves had retreated behind their borders and let those alliances wither. To Alleria, this seemed not wisdom, but waste. She spoke of these feelings to her mother, argued that Quel'Thalas would be stronger for maintaining connections with the other races, that there was value to be found in the diversity of the world beyond their forests. Larissa listened, as a good mother should, but she did not agree. The Ranger General had seen too much of the world outside Quel'Thalas, had dealt with humans and dwarves and other short-lived races, and she found them wanting. They were useful as allies in moments of crisis, perhaps, but their brief lives made them inconstant, their priorities shifting with each new generation, while the High Elves remained unchanging. The tension between mother and daughter grew as Alleria entered adulthood, as the weight of her destined role pressed it down upon her with increasing force. She chafed at the stagnation she perceived in Quel'Thalas, at the complacency that came from millennia of peace behind protected borders. She wanted to see the world, to meet other races and experience other cultures, to test herself against challenges that the comfortable forests of home could not provide. The world was vast and full of wonders, and Alleria could not understand why her people seemed content to ignore it. The breaking point came when Alleria made a decision that would change the course of her life and the lives of all who knew her. She went to her mother with words that she had rehearsed 1,000 times, words that she knew would wound deeply, but could no longer be left unspoken. She was abdicating her claim to the title of Ranger General. She was leaving Quel'Thalas with her ranger company to see the world beyond, and she was putting forward Sylvanas as her replacement in the line of succession. Larissa's reaction was a complex mixture of emotions that Alleria had expected but still found painful to witness. There was anger, certainly, at this rejection of everything the family had built. There was disappointment that her eldest daughter, in whom she had invested so much hope and training, was walking away from her duty. But there was also a deep sadness, a recognition that she had somehow failed to instill in Alleria the love of Quel'Thalas that burned so brightly in her own heart. The conversation was bitter. Alleria spoke bluntly, as was her nature, telling her mother that she did not belong in the role that had been prepared for her, that she would only fail if she tried to fulfill expectations that were not her own. Larissa accused her of selfishness, of placing her own desires above the needs of her people, of abandoning her family for adventure and novelty. Both said things they would later regret, wounds inflicted that would never fully heal. In the end, Larissa acquiesced to her daughter's demands. She had no real choice, for an unwilling Ranger General would serve Quel'Thalas poorly, and Sylvanas had already proved herself more than capable of carrying the mantle. But the Ranger General made clear that this decision came with consequences. Alleria was abandoning her birthright, turning her back on everything the Windrunner name represented. She would be a ranger without a homeland, a warrior without a cause, and whatever she found in the world beyond would never replace what she was leaving behind. Before Alleria departed, her mother gave her one final gift. It was a necklace and an exquisite piece of jewelry containing 3 gemstones, an emerald, a ruby, and a sapphire. The meaning was clear even without explanation. 3 gems for 3 daughters, bound together on a single chain, despite all that might separate them. Larissa might have been angry with Alleria, might have felt betrayed and disappointed, but she was still a mother who loved her child. The necklace was a reminder that no matter how far Alleria wandered, she would always be a Windrunner. Alleria left Quel'Thalas with a small company of rangers who shared her curiosity about the wider world. Varana, Relian, Auric, and Talthresser had all served under her, and they chose to follow her into the unknown rather than remain in the comfortable routine of border patrols and forest watches. They were the first elves in generations to venture beyond the kingdom's borders, not in response to some threat, but simply because they wished to see what lay beyond. For years, Alleria and her company roamed the lands of Lordaeron, learning about the humans and their kingdoms, their cities, and their cultures. She found much to admire in these short-lived people, their passion and their creativity, their ability to build and grow and change in ways that the ageless elves had long forgotten. She also found much to criticize, their petty conflicts and their short-sightedness, their tendency to repeat the mistakes of their ancestors. But she learned, and she grew, and she became someone that she could never have become within the golden forests of her birth. The lessons she learned during these years of wandering would prove invaluable when war came, when the peace of Azeroth was shattered by an invasion from another world entirely. The Second War began with the thunder of orcish drums and the screaming of a portal torn between worlds. The Dark Portal, a wound in reality itself, disgorged the Horde onto Azerothian soil, and nothing would ever be the same. The orcs came in numbers beyond counting, their green skin marking them as creatures corrupted by demonic blood, their bloodlust making them nearly unstoppable in battle. They swept through the human kingdoms like a tide of destruction, burning and killing with a savagery that the civilized peoples of Azeroth had never before encountered. For the high elves of Quel'Thalas, the war seemed distant at first, a conflict between humans and these strange invaders that had little to do with their isolated kingdom. The sunwells still burned with eternal light, the forests still bloomed with perpetual spring, and the borders remained secure under the watchful eyes of the Farstriders. Let the humans deal with their own problems, many thought. What concern was it of theirs? Alleria knew better. She had spent years among the humans, had come to understand and even care for them, and she recognized immediately that the threat posed by the Horde was one that would not respect the borders of Quel'Thalas. These orcs were not raiders looking for plunder or territory. They were conquerors, driven by a hunger for destruction that would not be satisfied until all of Azeroth lay in ruins. If the human kingdoms fell, Quel'Thalas would be next. She joined the Alliance of Lordaeron, the coalition of human kingdoms, and their allies that had formed to resist the orcish invasion. Her skills as a ranger made her invaluable as a scout and a hunter, and her company of elven archers provided firepower that the human armies lacked. The elven rangers could loose arrows with a speed and accuracy that no human archer could match, and their ability to move through forests without being detected made them perfect for reconnaissance and ambush operations. Alleria quickly earned a reputation among the Alliance command as one of their most reliable scouts. She would venture into territory controlled by the Horde, map their positions, identify their weak points, and return with intelligence that shaped the Alliance's battle plans. She killed orcs when she encountered them, certainly, but her value was not in the individual deaths she caused, but in the information she gathered. A single report from Alleria Windrunner could save thousands of Alliance lives by revealing enemy dispositions and movements. It was during this time that she first met the man who would become the great love of her life, a human paladin named Turalyon. Their first meeting was on a battlefield, as so many meetings were in those days. Alleria had just delivered intelligence about an orcish position when the camp was attacked, and she had found herself fighting alongside a young paladin whose skill with blade and light impressed her, despite her elven prejudice against the shorter-lived races. Turalyon was everything that Alleria had come to admire in humanity given form. He was brave and dedicated, a warrior of the light who fought not for glory or conquest, but because it was right. He had been a protege of Anduin Lothar, the great lion of Azeroth, and had learned from his mentor a nobility of purpose that shone through in everything he did. When Alleria first saw him leading troops in battle, rallying broken formations with the sheer force of his presence, she felt something stir in her heart that she had not expected. There was a gentleness to him that surprised her. Many of the human warriors she had encountered were crude and brutal, their lives so short that they seemed to compress everything into a desperate rush. But Turalyon took time to speak with her, to ask about her homeland and her family, to treat her as a person rather than simply a useful weapon. He was curious about the elves in the same way that she had been curious about the world beyond Quel'Thalas, and their conversations became a bright spot in the darkness of the war. Khadgar, the archmage who had helped close the dark portal during the First War, noticed the connection between them and approved. He had worked with both human and elven allies, understood how valuable such bonds could be, and he did nothing to discourage the relationship that was developing. If anything, he found ways to assign them to the same operations, to give them opportunities to work together that might not otherwise have occurred. Their relationship began cautiously, two warriors from very different backgrounds finding common ground in the crucible of war. Alleria was elven nobility, older than Turalyon by centuries, trained in the arts of the ranger since before his great-grandparents were born. He was a human knight, young by any standard, still learning the extent of his powers as a paladin of the Silver Hand. By all rights, they should have had nothing in common. And yet, something about him called to her, something about the light in his eyes and the conviction in his voice. But even as this unexpected romance began to bloom, tragedy struck. The Horde, not content with the destruction they had already wrought, turned their attention northward. They pushed into the borderlands of Quel'Thalas, burning the forests that the High Elves held sacred, massacring any who stood in their path. The news reached Alleria like a blade to the heart, for among those who fell were her own parents. Larissa Windrunner, Ranger General of Silvermoon, died defending the kingdom she had served for so long. Verath Windrunner died. Beside her, the politician and the warrior united in their final moments as they had been united in life. The orcs gave them no mercy, for the Horde knew nothing of mercy in those dark days. They butchered the Windrunner patriarch and matriarch like they butchered so many others, leaving their bodies for the crows in the burned-out husk of what had been their home. But the tragedy did not end there. In the chaos of the Horde's invasion, 18 members of the Windrunner family were killed. Uncles and aunts, cousins and kin, all cut down by orcish blades and axes. And among the dead was Lareth, the youngest of the 4 siblings, the brother whose gift for music had brought such joy to all who knew him. Lirath's death was particularly devastating because of the circumstances surrounding it. Despite his lack of physical prowess, he had wanted to fight, to do something to protect his people from the invaders who were destroying everything he loved. Sylvanas, now Ranger General in their mother's place, had refused to train him, unwilling to risk her precious baby brother in combat. She had sworn to protect him, to keep him safe in Silvermoon while the warriors dealt with the threat. But Lirath had found another teacher. He had gone to Verisa, who understood his need to contribute, his inability to simply sit and wait while his family fought and died. She had trained him in secret, teaching him the basics of combat and archery that might at least give him a chance to defend himself. When the Horde attacked Windrunner Village, Lirath was there trying to help, trying to be the warrior he had always wanted to be. He died there, in the village that bore his family name, his brief training no match for the experienced savagery of the orcish warriors. Sylvanas found his body and was consumed by grief and rage. She swore she would punish whoever had trained him to fight, believing that if he had remained in Silvermoon as she had ordered, he would still be alive. When Verisa admitted to being his teacher, Sylvanas stopped speaking to her entirely. The guilt that Verisa carried for her brother's death would haunt her for centuries to come. Alleria learned of her family's destruction while far from home, fighting alongside the human armies in the south. The messenger who brought the news found her composed on the surface, but shattered within, centuries of elven emotional discipline barely containing the fury and sorrow that threatened to consume her. Her parents were dead. Her brother was dead. Her family was destroyed, and the creatures who had done this were still out there, still killing, still burning. She returned to Quel'Thalas briefly, reuniting with her sisters amid the ruins of their childhood home. It was a bitter reunion, 3 survivors of a family that had once seemed invincible, standing together in the ashes of everything they had known. Sylvanas, now bearing the burden of Ranger General that Alleria had rejected, was cold and focused, channeling her grief into determination. Verisa was hollow-eyed with guilt and loss, barely able to look at her sisters, and Alleria felt something crystallize within her, a purpose that would drive her for years to come. Vengeance, not justice, not victory, but vengeance pure and simple. She would make the orcs pay for what they had done. Every orc that still drew breath was an insult to the memory of her parents, her brother, her murdered kin. She would hunt them to the ends of the earth and beyond, would not rest until she had extracted payment in blood for every drop that her family had shed. She fought the remainder of the Second War with this burning hatred fueling her every action. She was no longer just a ranger serving the Alliance. She was an instrument of retribution, a huntress seeking her prey. Her arrows found orcish hearts with unerring precision, and she took satisfaction in every kill in a way that troubled those who knew her best. This was not the curious, questioning elf who had left Quel'Thalas seeking adventure. This was something harder, something forged in grief and tempered in rage. And yet, even amid the darkness, there was light. Turalyon remained by her side, offering comfort when she would accept it, giving her space when she needed to be alone with her pain. He did not try to heal her hatred or counsel forgiveness. He understood that some wounds could not be healed with words, that some fires had to be allowed to burn themselves out. He simply loved her, and in time she found herself capable of loving him in return. Their relationship deepened as the war dragged on, becoming something that neither had anticipated. They were a paladin of the light and a ranger consumed by vengeance, a human with decades of life ahead of him, and an elf who might live for millennia, a follower of the holy light and a hunter who had little use for gods or faith. And yet, they fit together in ways that defied explanation, two broken pieces that somehow made a whole. When the Second War finally ended with the Horde's defeat and the destruction of the Dark Portal, many expected Alleria to return to Quel'Thalas, to take up her place among her people and help rebuild what had been destroyed. Instead, she remained in human lands, still hunting. For though the war was over, not all the orcs had been killed or captured. Remnants of the Bleeding Hollow clan had been trapped on Azeroth when the portal fell, and they lurked in the wilds, raiding and killing as they tried to survive. The Bleeding Hollow clan had been among the most savage of the orcish clans, warriors who honored their ancestors through ritual scarification and who believed that death in battle was the highest honor any orc could achieve. They had not surrendered when the dark portal fell, had not allowed themselves to be captured and interned in the camps that the Alliance was building for defeated orcs. Instead, they had scattered into the wilderness, breaking into small groups that were difficult to track and harder to eliminate. For Alleria, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. The scattered orcs were dangerous, certainly, capable of raiding isolated settlements and killing innocent people who thought the war was over. But they were also vulnerable in ways that the massed horde had never been. They could not reinforce each other, could not coordinate their actions, could not bring their numbers to bear against a concentrated alliance response. They were prey, and Alleria was the hunter they had created. Alleria made these survivors her personal project. She led an elite cadre of rangers in tracking and eliminating the remaining orcs, pursuing them through forests and mountains and swamps, giving them no rest and no quarter. Her vengeance was not yet complete, could not be complete while even one orc still breathed Azerothian air. She was relentless, tireless, driven by a hatred that showed no signs of fading. The campaign against the Bleeding Hollow remnants lasted for months, a slow and methodical hunt that took Alleria across the length and breadth of Lordaeron's wilderness. She learned the land intimately, memorized every game trail and hidden valley, developed a network of informants who would alert her when orcs were sighted. She became, in effect, a one-woman counterinsurgency operation, doing what the official Alliance forces could not or would not do. The other rangers who served with her during this period remembered a woman possessed. She slept little, ate only when necessary, spoke of nothing but the hunt. She took no pleasure in the kills themselves, showed no joy when another orc fell to her arrows. It was duty, not sport, a grim necessity that she would continue until there was nothing left to hunt. Some worried that she was losing herself to her vengeance, that the woman they had known was being consumed by the hunter she had become. It was during this period that Alleria discovered she was pregnant. The news should have been joyous, and in a way it was, but it also complicated everything. She was carrying Turalyon's child, a half-elf who would be one of only a handful of such beings in all of Azeroth. The life growing within her was proof of their love, a promise of hope in a world that had been dominated by war and death. And yet, she could not simply stop, could not abandon her quest for vengeance just because she was to be a mother. Eretor was born in the shadow of Netherguard Keep, the fortress that had been built to watch the ruins of the Dark Portal. He was a healthy child, blessed with his mother's elven features, softened by his father's human warmth. His eyes were green, like Alleria's, and those who saw him remarked on how much he resembled his mother. Turalyon looked upon his son with a wonder that brought tears to his eyes, this miracle of life that he and Alleria had created together. For a time, they were a family, the three of them, finding moments of peace amid the ongoing cleanup operations in the aftermath of the Second War. But even then, both Turalyon and Alleria knew that their duties would eventually tear them apart. The world was not yet safe, and there were battles yet to be fought that would demand everything they had. When word came that the Dark Portal had reopened, that the orcs were attacking from Draenor once more, the call to arms could not be ignored. The Alliance was forming an expedition to pursue the Horde to their homeworld, to carry the war to the enemy and ensure that they could never threaten Azeroth again. And both Turalyon and Alleria knew that they had to be part of it. The decision to leave Eretor behind was the hardest either of them had ever made. He was still an infant, only a few months old, far too young to accompany them on what might well be a suicide mission. They could not bring their baby to Draenor, to a world controlled by the Horde, to battles that neither of them might survive. And yet, how could they leave him, knowing they might never see him again? Alleria spent the night before their departure, holding her son, memorizing every detail of his face, trying to imprint him into her memory so deeply that no amount of time or distance could erase him. She whispered stories to him, tales of Quel'Thalas and the Windrunner family, histories that he was too young to understand, but that she needed to tell him anyway. She wanted him to know where he came from, even if she would not be there to teach him herself. Turalyon found her like that as dawn broke, tears streaming down her face, but her jaw set with determination. He did not try to comfort her with empty words or false promises. He simply sat beside her, his hand on her shoulder, sharing her grief in silence. They were both warriors, both understood that sometimes duty required sacrifices that cut to the very core of who they were. This was one of those times. In the end, there was no choice. Duty called, and the Windrunners had always answered duty's call, even when the cost was more than they could bear. Alleria brought Eretor to her sister Verisa, the aunt who would raise him if his parents did not return. Verisa, who had just lost her brother Lirith and was still grieving, accepted the responsibility without hesitation. She understood what it meant to be a Windrunner, understood that family meant both blood and sacrifice. The farewell was brief, because anything longer would have broken her, would have made her unable to do what needed to be done. She kissed her son's forehead, whispered promises she might not be able to keep, and then she walked away. Varisa called after her, but Alleria did not stop, did not turn around, did not let herself acknowledge the plea in her sister's voice. She did not look back. She could not afford to look back. If she had looked back, she would have seen her son's face, would have heard him cry for the mother who was abandoning him, and she would have broken. She would have stayed, would have held him, and never let go, and the expedition would have gone on without her. But the expedition needed her skills, needed her knowledge, needed the vengeance that drove her. And so she walked away from her son, and she did not look back, and a part of her heart stayed behind with him in that small room in Netherguard Keep. The Alliance expedition to Draenor was led by heroes whose names would be remembered for generations. Turalyon raised the banner of the Sons of Lothar, named in honor of his fallen mentor, and rallied the greatest warriors of the Alliance to his cause. Danath Trollbane of Stromgard brought his soldiers, hardened veterans of the Second War. Kurdran Wildhammer led his Griffin Riders, their aerial prowess essential for scouting and combat. The Archmage Khadgar contributed his vast magical knowledge, vital for confronting whatever sorcery the orcs might wield. And Alleria Windrunner came as the expedition's head scout, bringing her rangers and her bow and her burning need for vengeance to the red world that had spawned the Horde. For her, this was not just a military campaign. It was a chance to take the war to the enemy's home, to make them suffer on their own soil as they had made Azeroth suffer. Every orc she killed on Draenor was a blow struck for her parents, for Lirith, for all the fallen of her family. The expedition marched through the dark portal and found themselves in a world unlike any they had ever known. Draenor was a savage place, its red skies seeming to bleed overhead, its lands scarred by orcish warfare and demonic corruption. The green grass that had once covered its plains had long since died, replaced by dry earth and jagged rock. The forests that remained were twisted things, their trees grasping toward a sky that offered no comfort. But even this harsh environment could not dampen the resolve of the Alliance forces. They pushed forward, engaging the Horde wherever they found them, taking the fight to the orcish clans that had thought themselves safe on their home territory. Alleria's rangers ranged ahead of the main force, scouting enemy positions and picking off targets of opportunity. Her arrows seemed to find orcish hearts as if guided by the spirits of her murdered kin. During this campaign, Alleria and Turalyon's relationship deepened even further. The forced separation from their son, the constant danger of the campaign, the shared purpose that drove them, all served to strengthen the bond between them. What had begun as comfort found in the arms of a kindred spirit had grown into something profound, a love that transcended the differences between their peoples and the uncertainty of their futures. It was on Draenor that Alleria finally began to release the hatred that had consumed her since her family's murder. The change did not come easily or quickly. It was a gradual process, a slow thawing of the ice that had formed around her heart. But as she fought alongside Turalyon, as she saw the courage and nobility that the light inspired in him, she began to remember what it felt like to fight for something rather than against something. The turning point came during a battle that nearly claimed Turalyon's life. He was leading a charge against an entrenched orcish position when things went wrong, when the orcs proved more numerous and more prepared than expected. Alleria watched from a distance as he was overwhelmed, saw him go down under a press of green bodies, and felt something inside her snap. She fought her way to his side with a ferocity that surprised even her, cutting through orcs with a speed and precision that bordered on the supernatural. When she reached him, he was wounded but alive, his faith in the light having sustained him long enough for her to arrive. She held him as the battle raged around them, and for the first time since Lyrath's death, she wept. In that moment, she understood that she could not live on hatred alone. Vengeance might give purpose, but it could not give peace. The orcs had taken so much from her, but if she allowed them to take her capacity for love as well, then they would have truly won. She looked at Turalyon, this human she loved despite all reason, and she made a choice. She would not let go of her quest for justice, but she would temper it with the knowledge that there were things worth living for, as well as things worth dying for. The expedition continued, pushing deeper into Draenor, until they finally caught up with Ner'zhul, the orcish shaman whose dark magic had first opened the portal to Azeroth. They discovered that Ner'zhul was planning something even more terrible than another invasion. He was opening multiple portals to multiple worlds, seeking to escape Draenor entirely and spread the Horde's corruption across the cosmos. Ner'zhul had changed since the days when he had led the Shadowmoon clan as a respected elder. The demonic corruption that had been forced upon the orcs had twisted him, had transformed his spiritual gifts into something darker and more terrible. He no longer communed with the ancestral spirits that had guided his people for generations. Now he dealt with demons, with entities whose power came at a terrible price, whose assistance was never given freely. The artifacts he had gathered, powerful relics stolen from across Draenor and Azeroth, allowed him to tear holes in reality itself. Each portal required tremendous energy, energy that Ner'zhul drew from the planet beneath his feet. Draenor, already damaged by years of demonic warfare and the unchecked use of fell magic, could not sustain such abuse. Every portal the shaman opened pushed the world closer to destruction. The power required for such a feat was immense, and Draenor was already weakened from years of orcish abuse of fell magic. As Ner'zhul opened his portals, the planet itself began to tear apart. Massive earthquakes split the ground. Volcanoes that had been dormant for millennia erupted with catastrophic force. The very fabric of reality seemed to be unraveling, and everyone on Draenor could feel the end approaching. The sky itself began to change, darkening in some areas and blazing with unnatural light in others. The air grew thick with energies that made it difficult to breathe, that made magic behave unpredictably, that caused even the most experienced warriors to feel a bone-deep wrongness in everything around them. This was not a world that was being destroyed by war or disaster. This was a world being unmade, its very existence becoming unstable as the fabric of reality that held it together began to fray. The Alliance expedition faced an impossible choice. They could retreat through the dark portal, return to Azeroth and safety, abandoning their mission but preserving their lives. Or they could stay, try to close the dark portal from the Draenor side, and trap themselves on a dying world in the hope of preventing any further invasion of their homeworld. They chose to stay. Khadgar worked his magic on the portal, while Turalyon, Alleria, and the others held back the orcish forces that sought to stop them. It was the most desperate battle of their lives, fighting against impossible odds while the world literally crumbled around them. But they held long enough for Khadgar to complete his spell, long enough for the portal to collapse and sever the connection to Azeroth. When the dust settled, the sons of Lothar found themselves stranded on a dying world with no way home. The dark portal was destroyed, its energies scattered to the winds. Azeroth was safe, but they were trapped, presumed dead by everyone who had known and loved them. Alleria's last thought before the chaos consumed them was of Eretor, her baby son whom she might never see again. The survivors regrouped as Draenor continued to tear itself apart, eventually stabilizing into the shattered realm that would come to be known as Outland. Most of the expedition established a base at Honor Hold in what had been Hellfire Peninsula, preparing for a long and uncertain exile. But Turalyon and Alleria did not remain with their comrades. During the Cataclysm, they had become separated from the main force, pulled through one of Ner'zhul's unstable portals into the twisting Nether itself. They were lost, adrift in a realm between dimensions, the vast and terrible void that existed between the worlds. For others, this would have been death, an end lost in infinite chaos. But they were found, discovered by beings who had been fighting their own war against an enemy that threatened all of existence. The twisting Nether was not empty. It was the realm of demons, the hunting ground of the Burning Legion, the infinite horde that had been working to destroy all creation since before the dawn of mortal history. But it was also home to those who opposed the Legion, survivors of worlds that had fallen to the demons' crusade, refugees who had banded together in a desperate attempt to fight back. Chief among these were the Naru, beings of pure light whose very existence was anathema to the darkness that the Legion served. They had gathered the scattered remnants of 1,000 lost civilizations into the Army of the Light, a coalition of survivors dedicated to ending the burning crusade once and for all. And it was the Naru who found Turalyon and Alleria, lost and alone in the vastness of the Nether. Zera, the prime Naru, was the first to speak with them. She was a being of incredible power, her form a constantly shifting constellation of light and sacred geometry. She had guided the Army of the Light for millennia, leading them in their war against the Legion, never losing faith that eventually, somehow, they would prevail. When she encountered Turalyon and Alleria, she saw in them not just survivors, but potential champions who could help turn the tide of the eternal war. They joined the Army of the Light, not because they had much choice, but because the cause resonated with everything they believed. The Burning Legion was the ultimate evil, the force that had created the orcs' bloodlust, that had driven the Horde to invade Azeroth, that was ultimately responsible for all the suffering that Alleria had endured. Fighting the Legion was fighting the source of all her pain, the root of the evil that had murdered her family. The Army of the Light itself was a remarkable collection of survivors. There were Draenei who had fled their homeworld when the Legion corrupted the Eredar, who had been running and fighting for millennia before Turalyon and Alleria were born. There were races Alleria had never heard of, beings from worlds that no longer existed, refugees from civilizations that the Legion had consumed entirely. They came from every corner of the cosmos, united only by their determination to resist the darkness that threatened all of creation. The Zenidar was the flagship of the army's fleet, a massive vessel of golden light that served as both transport and fortress. It was here that Turalyon and Alleria made their home during the centuries of war that followed, here that they trained and planned and recovered between battles. The ship's corridors became as familiar to Alleria as the forests of Quel'Thalas had once been, though she never stopped longing for the golden leaves and clear streams of her homeland. Life aboard the Zenidar was governed by the rhythms of war. There were assaults to plan, intelligence to gather, wounds to heal, and spirits to maintain. The army fought not with the reckless abandon of those who expected to win quickly, but with the patient determination of those who understood that their struggle might last forever. Victory might never come, but surrender was not an option. The Legion had to be opposed, had to be slowed, had to be made to pay for every world it consumed. But fighting a war across the twisting Nether was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Time did not flow normally in that realm between realities. What might be days for them could be years or centuries on Azeroth, or the reverse. They lost all sense of how long they had been away, how much time had passed since they had held their infant son, since they had said goodbye to everyone they loved. For Turalyon, the passage of time presented an additional challenge. He was human, and humans did not live forever. Even the most powerful paladins eventually aged and died, their bodies succumbing to the mortal nature that defined their kind. If he remained in the Nether for centuries, he would simply cease to be, leaving Alleria alone in a realm of eternal war. Zera offered a solution. She could infuse Turalyon with the light itself, binding it to his very soul in a way that would grant him agelessness to match his elven beloved. It was a profound transformation, one that would change him on a fundamental level, but it would also ensure that he and Alleria could remain together for however long their war required. Turalyon accepted, and the light filled him as it had filled no mortal before. He became something more than human, a being of light incarnate, his eyes burning with golden fire, his presence radiating holy power. The transformation was painful and glorious, a death and rebirth that left him forever changed, but still fundamentally himself. When he looked upon Alleria after the ritual was complete, she saw the same man she loved, only now he was capable of loving her for as long as she lived. Together, they fought the Legion across countless worlds and countless battles. They led assaults on demon fortresses, rescued prisoners from fates worse than death, struck at the Legion's supply lines and command structures. They became legends within the army of the Light, the Windrunner and the High Exarch, the Ranger and the Paladin, whose love sustained them through horrors that would have broken lesser beings. From their perspective, this war lasted for 1,000 years, a millennium of combat, of sacrifice, of small victories and devastating losses, of hope and despair in equal measure. They watched friends fall and new allies rise. They saw worlds saved and worlds lost. They aged in experience, if not in body, becoming veterans of a conflict that spanned galaxies and eras. The scale of the war was beyond anything that mortal minds were designed to comprehend. They fought on planets whose names were unpronounceable, against demons whose forms defied description in battles that would never be recorded in any history because there was no one left to record them. They freed prisoners from Legion torture facilities, disrupted demonic supply lines, assassinated commanders whose deaths would throw entire armies into chaos. They learned to think in terms of centuries, to plan operations that would not bear fruit for generations, to accept that they might not live to see the results of their sacrifices. Alleria found a strange peace in this eternal war. She had always been a warrior, but on Azeroth, warfare had been something temporary, a disruption of normal life that was meant to end so that peace could return. Here, in the twisting Nether, war was the normal state of existence. There was no peace to return to, no life beyond the conflict. In a way, it simplified everything. She did not have to wonder what she would do when the fighting stopped, because the fighting would never stop. Turalyon struggled more with the endless nature of their struggle. He was a creature of faith, and faith required hope, required the belief that eventually the light would triumph and the darkness would be vanquished. But as centuries passed with no end in sight, as victory after victory failed to bring them any closer to a final resolution, even his faith was tested. There were moments when he wondered if they were accomplishing anything at all, if the Legion was simply too vast and too powerful to ever be defeated. In those moments, Alleria was his anchor, as he was hers. She reminded him of why they fought, of the world they were protecting, of the son who waited for them to return. He reminded her that hatred alone was not enough, that there had to be something worth fighting for beyond the destruction of their enemies. Together, they endured what neither could have survived alone. And then, on a demon world that had been corrupted by something even the Legion feared, everything changed. The Army of the Light had launched an assault on a Legion prison facility, hoping to rescue captives before they could be turned into demonic soldiers. But when they arrived, they found something unexpected. The demons were dead, all of them, not killed by any weapon the army recognized, but consumed by something else entirely, something that had devoured them from within. It was the void. The void was the antithesis of light, the primordial darkness that existed before creation, the whispers of entities older and more terrible than even the demons of the Legion. It was corruption given form, madness given voice, an entropy that sought to consume all of existence and return it to the nothingness from which it had come. The light and the void were eternally opposed, two cosmic forces locked in a conflict that made the war against the Legion seem like a minor skirmish. The planet the army had invaded had been completely consumed by the void. Its surface was twisted and wrong, its very reality unstable, its atmosphere filled with whispers that clawed at the mind. The demons who had come here had been destroyed not by any weapon, but by the void itself, their physical forms unraveled by energies they could not comprehend. As Alleria explored this nightmare landscape, searching for survivors who might still need rescue, she was attacked. Tendrils of void energy lashed out from the darkness, striking her before she could react, forcing their way into her body and her mind. She felt them inside her, alien presences that whispered promises and threats in equal measure, that showed her visions of futures possible and impossible. The infection did not kill her. It changed her. She could feel the void within her now, a second presence sharing space in her consciousness, granting her glimpses of power and insight that she had never imagined possible. She could see threads of darkness connecting all things, could hear the whispers of entities that existed beyond the veil of reality. It was terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. The army of the light did not know what to make of her transformation. Zera, in particular, was troubled. The light and the void could not coexist, she insisted. They were fundamentally incompatible, two sides of a cosmic coin that could never be reconciled. Alleria was contaminated, corrupted, a risk to everyone around her. She should be purified, or if purification proved impossible, eliminated. But Alleria was not willing to give up her new abilities so easily. She had seen what the void could do to demons, had witnessed its power to destroy creatures that the light could only wound. The Legion was an existential threat to all of creation, and the army of the light needed every weapon it could find. If the void could be turned against the demons, if she could learn to wield it without being consumed by it, then the infection might be a blessing rather than a curse. She sought out information about the void, learned everything she could from the army's records and the memories of those who had encountered it before. And eventually, she learned of a being called the Locus-Walker, an ethereal who had mastered the void without losing himself to its whispers. If anyone could teach her to control her new powers, it was him. Locus-Walker was unlike any being Alleria had ever encountered. He was an ethereal, one of the Karishi, a race that had been transformed into creatures of energy when their homeworld was consumed by the Void Lord Dimensius. But where most ethereals who had survived that catastrophe avoided the void, fearing the power that had destroyed their world, Locus-Walker had done the opposite. Yes, he had studied it, mastered it, learned to wield its energies without succumbing to its corruption. He was not easy to find. The ethereals traveled the cosmos as merchants and collectors, but Locus-Walker moved according to his own inscrutable purposes. Alleria spent years tracking rumors and following leads, all while continuing to fight against the Legion as part of the Army of the Light. Zera grew increasingly concerned about her fascination with the void, eventually forbidding her to continue her search. Alleria acquiesced to the Naru's command, but she did not abandon her conviction that the void could be used for good. She had felt its power, had seen what it could do to demons. How could she simply ignore such a potent weapon when the fate of the universe hung in the balance? The light was beautiful and pure, but purity alone might not be enough to win this war. Her chance came when both she and Locus-Walker were captured by the Legion, imprisoned on the demon world of Niskara. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent years searching for the ethereal, and now they were cellmates in a Legion dungeon, both awaiting whatever torments their captors had planned. Locus-Walker's physical form had been damaged in his capture, his ethereal wrappings destroyed, leaving him as little more than a cloud of energy barely held together by will alone. But his power remained, and his knowledge was intact. When Alleria used the void instinctively to kill the Inquisitor who was torturing them, Locus-Walker recognized her potential. Here was a being who had been touched by the void and had not immediately gone mad. Here was a student worthy of his teachings. He opened a rift into the void itself, a gateway to the primordial darkness that existed beyond all realities. Together, they escaped their prison and entered a realm of absolute nothingness, a place where concepts like up and down, before and after, had no meaning. It was terrifying beyond measure, but Alleria found that with Locus-Walker's guidance, she could navigate it without losing herself. Their first lesson was about sanity. The void whispered constantly, voices that offered power and knowledge and pleasure and pain, that showed visions of every possible future, including the most terrible ones. Most who heard these whispers eventually succumbed, their minds shattered by the endless chorus, their wills subsumed by entities that cared nothing for mortal existence. Locus-Walker taught Alleria to hear without listening, to acknowledge the whispers without obeying them, to accept the void as part of herself without becoming a slave to it. He taught her about the nature of light and shadow, how they were two sides of the same cosmic force rather than absolute good and evil. The light saw only one path, the one it deemed correct, and shunned all others as lies. The void saw every possible path and considered them all equally true. Both perspectives were incomplete, and the truly wise learned to draw on both without being blinded by either. Locus-Walker shared the history of his own people, the K'arishi, who had once been a thriving civilization on a world called Karish. They had been masters of technology and magic, builders of wonders that would have astounded even the high elves of Quel'Thalas. But then Dimensius the All-Devouring had come, a void lord whose hunger consumed entire realities. The K'arishi had fought, had resisted with everything they possessed, but they had not been prepared for an enemy that existed beyond the boundaries of their understanding. When K'arish fell, when the void consumed everything the K'arishi had built, the survivors were transformed. Their physical bodies could not exist in the void's corruption, but their spirits persisted, bound together by bandages and willpower, becoming the ethereals that now wandered the cosmos. Most ethereals wanted nothing to do with the void after what it had done to them. They had lost everything, and the trauma of that loss made them fear even the memory of the power that had destroyed their world. But Locus-Walker had taken a different path. He had studied the void, had learned its secrets, had mastered its power rather than fleeing from it. He understood that knowledge was never evil in itself, that it was the use of knowledge that determined its moral character. The void was a tool, a force of nature, neither good nor evil, but simply powerful. Those who learned to wield it responsibly could accomplish great things. Those who succumbed to it became monsters. This was heresy by the standards of the Army of the Light, and Alleria knew that Xera would never accept it. But she had felt the truth of Locus-Walker's words in her own experience, had seen how the light's certainty could become inflexibility, how its purity could become intolerance. She was not abandoning the cause she had fought for during centuries of war. She was expanding her understanding of it. Locus-Walker also delved into Alleria's memories, exploring the events that had shaped her into the warrior she had become. He saw her childhood in Quel'Thalas, the conflict with her mother, the decision to leave her homeland behind. He witnessed the Second War through her eyes, felt the grief of losing her parents and brother, understood the hatred that had consumed her for so long. He traced the arc of her relationship with Turalyon, the love that had grown from tragedy, the choice to leave her infant son behind to fight a war that might never end. Through this exploration, he helped Alleria understand herself in ways she never had before. The void fed on emotion, on pain and fear and desire, and if she was to master it, she needed to understand her own emotional landscape. The grief she still carried for her family, the guilt over abandoning Eretor, the fear of losing Turalyon, these were not weaknesses to be purged, but parts of herself to be acknowledged and integrated. The void would try to use them against her, would whisper that her pain could be turned into power, would offer to make her sorrows disappear in exchange for her will. She had to know herself well enough to reject those offers, to hold on to her identity even when the whispers became overwhelming. The training continued for what felt like centuries, though time in the void was even more meaningless than time in the Nether. Alleria learned to create portals through the void, doorways that could transport her anywhere she had the knowledge to imagine. She learned to summon tendrils of shadow energy, to wrap herself in darkness that would protect her from harm, to call upon the whispers for information rather than simply enduring them as madness. But her training was cut short. Through the void, through the visions it granted her, she saw Turalyon in danger. Her beloved, her partner through 1,000 years of war, was about to die on a world far from where she was. The details were unclear, the vision fragmentary, but the message was unmistakable. If she did not act, she would lose him. She left Locus-Walker without a proper farewell, tearing through the void to reach the battlefield where Turalyon was making his last stand. The journey was longer and more dangerous than anything she had attempted before, a desperate sprint across dimensions that should have been impossible. But Alleria had spent centuries learning to do impossible things, and she would not let something as minor as the laws of reality prevent her from saving the man she loved. She arrived in a storm of shadow, her new powers on full display as she cut through the demons that threatened her love. The void that had once been a curse was now her weapon, wielded with skill that surprised even Locus-Walker's expectations. She moved like darkness itself, her bow singing as she loosed arrows wreathed in shadow, her very presence an anathema to the demons that surrounded Turalyon's position. They fell before her like wheat before a scythe, their demonic forms dissolving into nothing as the void consumed them. Turalyon had been fighting for hours by then, his light almost exhausted, his armor dented and scarred, his body covered in wounds that even his faith could not fully heal. When he saw Alleria emerge from the shadows, when he watched her tear through the demon horde with powers he did not recognize, he did not know whether to be relieved or terrified. The woman he loved had become something else, something that blazed with darkness as he blazed with light, and he was not sure what that meant for their future. But they would have a future. That was what mattered in that moment, as the last of the demons fell and Alleria stood before him, her eyes glowing with purple fire, but her smile the same one he had fallen in love with centuries ago. Whatever she had become, she was still Alleria. She had still come for him, had still risked everything to save him, and he loved her, whatever she was, whatever she would become. She saved Turalyon, but saving him meant revealing what she had become, exposing the shadow that now lived within her to the harsh light of the army's judgment. Zera was waiting when they returned to the Zenadar, and the Naru's reaction was everything that Alleria had feared. The Prime Naru declared that Alleria had been corrupted, that the Void had claimed her, that she could no longer be trusted as a member of the army of the light. She demanded that Alleria renounce the shadow, submit to purification, allow the light to burn away the darkness that had taken root in her soul. It was not a suggestion, but a command, delivered with all the authority that Zera could muster. Alleria refused. She had spent centuries fighting the Legion, had sacrificed everything for the cause that Zera claimed to champion. She had lost her homeworld, lost her family, lost the first decades of her son's life, all in service to a war that the army of the light was not winning. The void was a tool, nothing more, a weapon that could be turned against the demons if properly controlled. She would not abandon it simply because Zera was afraid of what she might become. For her defiance, Alleria was imprisoned. The army of the light locked her away, treating her as a threat rather than an ally, as a prisoner rather than a hero. It was a bitter betrayal after everything she had given, and in her cell she had plenty of time to contemplate the ironies of her situation. But Alleria Windrunner was not one to accept captivity quietly. She bided her time, conserved her strength, and waited for an opportunity. And when that opportunity came, when events beyond her control created chaos that diverted her guards, she escaped. The final war against the Burning Legion came to Azeroth, as it had always been destined to. The demons invaded once more powerful than ever before, threatening to destroy everything that Alleria had fought to protect. The tomb of Sargeras, sealed for millennia, had been opened by Gul'dan, and through it poured endless waves of demons that overwhelmed the defenders of the broken shore. King Varian Wrynn died in that first battle, sacrificing himself to give the Alliance forces a chance to retreat. The war that followed was the most desperate that Azeroth had ever faced. But this time, Azeroth fought back with weapons and allies that the Legion had not expected. The Pillars of Creation, ancient artifacts of unimaginable power, were gathered to close the tomb and stem the demonic tide. And among those allies was the Army of the Light, finally bringing its crusade to the world where everything had started. They came not as invaders, but as liberators, determined to end the Legion's threat once and for all. For Alleria, returning to Azeroth was complicated by the fact that she could not actually return immediately. The void within her made it difficult to traverse certain magical barriers, and the army was hesitant to deploy her on a world that they considered sacred ground. She watched from afar as the defenders of Azeroth fought and died, as the champions closed the tomb and pushed back the demonic invasion, as the war began to turn in their favor. Alleria was part of that return, though her status within the army remained complicated. She fought alongside Turalyon and the other champions, using her void powers against the demons, even as some regarded her with suspicion and fear. The whispers had grown louder since her transformation, the void constantly suggesting ways to use her powers that would have horrified the light-worshipping soldiers who fought beside her. She ignored them, as she always did, but their presence was a constant reminder of the price she had paid for her abilities. When the campaign brought them to Argus, the Legion's homeworld, she finally had the opportunity to confront the source of all the evil that had shaped her life. Argus was a world transformed by millennia of demonic occupation. Once it had been the homeworld of the Eridar, a beautiful planet of crystal spires and magical wonders. Now it was a nightmare, its surface scarred by fell corruption, its sky perpetually burning with the green fire of the Legion's power. It was on Argus that Alleria encountered Locus-Walker again. The ethereal had his own reasons for being on the demon world, investigating the activities of the Shadow Guard, a faction of ethereals who had been completely consumed by the void. Where Locus-Walker used the void as a tool, the Shadow Guard had become its slaves, agents of an entropy that sought to devour all of existence. Together, they discovered that something far worse was being prepared. The Eridar sorcerers of the Legion had captured a darkened Naru, a being called Lura, who had fallen from the light and been corrupted into a creature of pure shadow. They were using her to open rifts into the void, hoping to harness its power for their own purposes without understanding the forces they were attempting to control. Locus-Walker saw an opportunity. If Alleria could absorb Lura's essence, could contain the dark Naru's power within herself, she would achieve a level of mastery over the void that he had never imagined possible. It was dangerous, potentially fatal, but the potential reward was immense. She would become something new, something that had never existed before, a being who could walk between light and shadow without belonging entirely to either. The battle was brutal. Lura did not want to be absorbed, fought with all the power that had once made her a beacon of the light. But Alleria had been training for this her entire life, had been fighting against impossible odds since the day she first picked up a bow. With Locus-Walker's guidance and her own iron will, she drew the dark Naru into herself, consuming the essence of a fallen god. The transformation was immediate and total. Alleria's body shifted, her skin darkening with void energy, her eyes becoming pools of purple shadow. She could feel Lura inside her, not as a separate consciousness, but as power integrated into her very being. The void whispers were louder than ever, but she could now control them with a thought, could turn them on and off like a lantern's flame. She had become the first void elf, a being of shadow who still maintained her free will, her morality, her love for those she cared about. It was everything she had hoped for and more, proof that the void could be mastered rather than merely endured. Zera had been wrong. The light was not the only path to power, and the shadow was not inevitably corruption. But the moment of triumph was complicated by what followed. When the army of the light finally confronted the Legion's leadership, when Zera attempted to forcibly infuse Illidan's storm rage with the light against his will, Alleria saw the darkness that could hide within even the most radiant being. Illidan killed the Prime Naru rather than submit to her vision of destiny, and while Alleria did not condone the murder, she understood the motivation. Some beings could not be forced into molds they had not chosen. The Legion fell. Sargeras, the Dark Titan who had created the Burning Crusade, was defeated and imprisoned by the pantheon of his brother Titans. The war that Alleria had fought for 1,000 years was finally over, and for the first time since she had stepped through the dark portal as a young ranger burning for vengeance, she was free to return home. But what was home? Azeroth had changed in the decades she had been gone. The kingdom of Lord Aeron had fallen to the Scourge. Quel'Thalas had been devastated, and the Sunwell destroyed, only to be restored with different energy than before. The High Elves she had known were now Blood Elves, aligned with the Horde rather than the Alliance. Everything she remembered was gone, replaced by a world she barely recognized. And then there was her family. Eretor, her son, was no longer an infant. He was a grown man now, a paladin like his father, who had spent his entire life believing his parents were dead. The reunion was tearful and joyful and complicated, decades of absence not easily bridged by a single embrace. She looked upon the man he had become and saw both herself and Turalyon in his features, saw the child she had left behind grown into a hero in his own right. Eretor had been raised by Varisa and Ronan, the aunt and uncle who had stepped into the role of parents when his own had vanished into the chaos of Draenor's destruction. He had grown up hearing stories of his parents, legends really, tales of the brave ranger and the noble paladin who had sacrificed everything to protect Azeroth from the Horde. He had been told that they were heroes, that their deaths had meaning, that he should be proud to carry their names. But knowing that his parents were heroes did not make their absence any easier to bear. Eretor had spent his childhood longing for the father he would never know, the mother whose face he remembered only from paintings and descriptions. He had become a paladin, in part because it connected him to Turalyon, a way of honoring the man who had given him life, even if that man was not present to see what his son had become. When word came that Turalyon and Alleria were alive, that they had been fighting the Legion in the twisting Nether for all these years, Eretor did not know how to react. Joy, certainly, that his parents had not died as he had always believed, but also confusion and perhaps a hint of anger. They had been alive all this time. They had been out there somewhere, fighting a war, while he grew up an orphan. They had not abandoned him by choice, but they had abandoned him nonetheless. The reunion had been everything Alleria had hoped for and everything she had feared. She held her son, this stranger who shared her blood, and tried to bridge the gap of decades with a single embrace. She told him she was sorry, that there had been no way to return, that she had thought of him every day of the 1,000 years she had spent away. He told her he understood, that he had never stopped believing they would come back someday, that he was proud to finally meet the heroes he had spent his life trying to emulate. But understanding did not equal forgiveness, not immediately. The relationship between Alleria and Eretor was complicated in ways that would take years to fully untangle. She had missed his first steps, his first words, his training as a paladin, his moments of triumph, and his moments of despair. She had missed everything that had made him who he was, and no amount of love could change that simple fact. They would have to build a new relationship from scratch, mother and son, learning to know each other as the adults they had become, rather than the infant and parent they had been. More difficult was learning about Sylvanas. Her middle sister, the one who had embraced the destiny Alleria had rejected, had not simply died during the Scourge invasion. She had been raised as a banshee, transformed into an undead creature by the Lich King's power, and had eventually claimed leadership of the Forsaken. Now she was war chief of the Horde, the same Horde that had murdered their parents and brother, that had burned the forests of Quel'Thalas. Alleria could not process this information easily. The sister she remembered, the fierce and dedicated ranger who had loved their brother so dearly, had become something monstrous. Not merely dead, but undead. Not merely changed, but corrupted into a creature of darkness who served as the leader of Azeroth's enemies. The Void whispered terrible things about Sylvanas, visions of futures where she brought ruin to everything Alleria held dear, and Verisa, her youngest sister, had also built a life in her absence. Married to the mage Ronan, who had died in the destruction of Theramore, raising twin sons who carried the Windrunner legacy, leading the Silver Covenant in their continuing war against any who would threaten Quel'Thalas. Verisa was the bridge between who they had been and who they had become, the one sister who still seemed familiar to Alleria even after all the years. A statue of Alleria had been erected in the Valley of Heroes at the entrance to Stormwind City, honoring her as one of the greatest champions of the Alliance. She stood frozen in stone, bow drawn, eyes fixed on enemies that existed only in memory. It was strange to see herself memorialized like this, to be treated as a legend when she felt so very mortal, so very lost in a world she no longer understood. In the aftermath of the Legion's defeat, the three Windrunner sisters attempted a reunion. Alleria had been gone for 1,000 years from her perspective, had missed everything that had happened to her family, had lost touch with the siblings who had once been the center of her world. She wanted to reconnect, to see if there was anything left of the bond they had shared in their youth. The reunion took place at Windrunner Spire, the ancestral home of their family that had been overrun by undead since the fall of Quel'Thalas. It seemed fitting to reclaim this place together, to clear it of the darkness that had consumed it as a symbol of what they might yet repair in their own relationships. Alleria proposed it, Verisa agreed immediately, and Sylvanas, surprisingly, accepted as well. They journeyed together through the Ghostlands, three sisters who had once been inseparable, now awkward and uncertain in each other's presence. Alleria saw signs of the Scourge's passage everywhere, the devastation that had transformed her homeland into a haunted wasteland. She felt the void respond to the death energy that permeated the land, felt its whispers grow louder as they approached the site of so much tragedy. Along the way, they played a game that they had played as children, a game of truths where each sister shared something she had never told the others. It was meant to bring them closer, to rebuild the trust that time and circumstance had eroded. Alleria spoke of her time with the Army of the Light, of her love for Turalyon, of the sacrifice of leaving Eretor behind. Verisa spoke of her guilt over Lirath's death, of the marriage to Ronan that had given her twin sons and then ended in tragedy. But when it came to Sylvanas's turn, the game collapsed. The war chief refused to share her truths, refused to open herself to sisters she no longer felt she could trust. The walls that Undeath had built around her were too high, the distance between who she was and who she had been too great. She turned away from the game and from them, and the fragile peace they had constructed began to fracture. Things got worse when Alleria approached Sylvanas with a genuine desire to understand her sister's new nature. She reached out with her void senses, trying to perceive what Sylvanas had become, trying to find some trace of the sister she had loved in that undead creature before her. What she found horrified her. The void hated Sylvanas. The whispers that Alleria could usually control became a screaming chorus, demanding that she destroy the abomination standing before her, insisting that Sylvanas was a threat to everything that existed. Alleria saw visions of futures where Sylvanas brought ruin to Azeroth, where her actions led to the death of millions, where the Windrunner legacy became a synonym for betrayal and destruction. She fought against the whispers, refused to act on their demands, but Sylvanas had seen the conflict in her eyes. The war chief understood that something had just happened, that her eldest sister had nearly attacked her, that the powers Alleria wielded saw her as an enemy to be destroyed. The fragile trust between them, already strained, shattered completely. The reunion ended without reconciliation. Alleria told Sylvanas to keep her secrets, declared that she had come to see if she still had a family, because Lirath would have wanted her to try, but that it was clear now that her family was broken beyond repair. She left the Ghostlands with Verisa, both of them uncertain whether they would ever see their middle sister again, whether there was anything left of the Windrunner family worth saving. The journey back to Alliance territory was somber. Verisa tried to find words of comfort, tried to suggest that perhaps with more time things might be different, that Sylvanas might eventually open herself to reconciliation. But Alleria knew better. She had seen what the void showed her, the futures where Sylvanas brought destruction to everything they held dear. Those visions might not be inevitable, might represent only one of many possible paths, but they felt true in a way that Alleria could not ignore. The Void Whispers had been right about many things over the centuries she had carried them. They had warned her about threats before they materialized, had shown her truths that others could not see, and they had shown her Sylvanas's potential for devastation with a clarity that haunted her dreams. Perhaps the war chief could still change, could still become something other than the monster the void predicted, but Alleria would not bet the fate of Azeroth on that hope. Verisa did not understand, could not understand what Alleria had experienced in that moment. The youngest Windrunner sister still saw Sylvanas as their sister, corrupted but not entirely lost. She had maintained a relationship with the war chief even during the conflicts between Alliance and Horde, had visited the Undercity when circumstances allowed, had held on to the hope that family could transcend political differences. To Verisa, what Alleria had felt was simply the void's influence, a darkness that should be resisted rather than trusted. They parted ways with promises to stay in touch, to maintain the bond between them even if Sylvanas could not be part of it. But both knew that the Windrunner family would never be what it once was, would never again be three sisters standing together against the darkness. That family had died with Lirath, perhaps, or with their parents, or with Sylvanas's first death at the hands of Arthas. All that remained now were echoes and regrets. But Alleria's troubles with her homeland were not over. Shortly after the failed reunion, she visited the Sunwell, the sacred font of power that had sustained the High Elves for millennia. The Sunwell had been restored during her absence, rekindled with the holy energies of Moru, a Naru who had sacrificed itself to save the blood elven people. Alleria wanted to see this miracle, to connect with the most sacred site of her homeland, even though she was no longer welcome there. The visit was meant to be a gesture of goodwill, arranged by Lorthamar Theron, the Regent Lord of Quel'Thalas. Whatever political differences existed between them, Lorthamar was not cruel enough to deny a daughter of Quel'Thalas the chance to see the Sunwell, especially one who had sacrificed so much in service to their people. But when Alleria approached the plateau where the Sunwell blazed with restored power, something went terribly wrong. Her very presence, saturated as it was with void energy, created a resonance with the Sunwell's holy power. The energies reacted violently, and Alleria became an unwitting conduit for void horrors that tried to force their way into reality. Shadow creatures emerged from rifts that opened around her, attacking the Sunwell's guardians and threatening to corrupt the restored font of power. She fought alongside the others to close the rifts, combining her mastery of the void with the arcane skills of Grand Magister Romath and First Arcanist Thalisra. Together, they managed to seal the breach and prevent the catastrophe that her presence had nearly caused. But the damage was done. Romath, furious at what had nearly happened, demanded that Alleria be arrested as a saboteur. He blamed her entirely for the attack, refusing to acknowledge that she had not intended to cause harm, that she had fought as hard as anyone to prevent the Sunwell's corruption. To him, she was not a hero who had made a mistake, but an enemy who had revealed her true nature. Lor'themar intervened before Romath's guards could take her into custody. But even he could not ignore what had happened, could not pretend that Alleria's presence did not pose a genuine danger to Quel'Thalas's most sacred site. He banished her from the blood elven homeland, declaring that she could never return while the void still lived within her. Alleria accepted the banishment with what dignity she could muster. But as she left, she made it clear that this was not the end. She had been born in Quel'Thalas, had spent centuries fighting for its protection, and she would not accept permanent exile from her homeland. Someday, somehow, she would find a way to return. Before she departed, Alleria learned something from her confrontation with Romath that would change the course of her future. The Grand Magister mentioned blood elves who had been exiled for studying the void, outcasts who posed the same danger to the Sunwell that Alleria herself represented. They had been cast out of Quel'Thalas, left to fend for themselves, punished for pursuing knowledge that the blood elven leadership deemed too dangerous. Alleria saw an opportunity. These exiles were her kindred in more ways than one, elves who had been touched by the same power that defined her, who faced the same struggles with the whispers and the corruption. If she could find them, she could help them, and perhaps, together, they could become something new. The trail led Alleria to Magister Umbric, a scholar whose fascination with the void had brought him into conflict with the blood elven establishment. Umbric had been searching for new sources of magical power to replace the Sunwell dependency that had nearly destroyed his people, and his research had led him to the Shadow. When his superiors discovered what he was studying, they cast him and his followers out, deeming them too dangerous to remain in Quel'Thalas. Umbric's story was a tragic one, born of desperation and good intentions gone awry. After the Scourge destroyed the Sunwell, the Blood Elves had suffered terribly from magical withdrawal. Their entire civilization had been built around the Sunwell's energies, their very physiology dependent on the font of power that had sustained them for millennia. Without it, they had withered, had become hollow shells of their former selves, consumed by a hunger that nothing seemed to satisfy. Some had turned to fail magic, siphoning energy from demons to fill the void left by the Sunwell's destruction. This had worked after a fashion, but it had changed them, had turned their eyes from the blue of pure magic to the green of corruption. When the Sunwell was restored, many had hoped that the worst was over, that they could return to what they had been before the tragedy. But Umbric had not been satisfied with simply returning to the old ways. He remembered the desperation of those dark days, remembered how close his people had come to extinction, and he was determined to find alternative sources of power that could sustain them if the Sunwell ever failed again. His research had led him to the void, to ancient texts and forbidden knowledge that promised power beyond anything the Sunwell could provide. He had not intended to endanger anyone. He had conducted his research carefully, had taken precautions that he believed would protect others from any negative consequences. But the void was not so easily contained, and eventually his superiors had discovered what he was doing. They had given him a choice: abandon his research or leave Quel'Thalas forever. Umbric had chosen exile, believing that his work was too important to abandon. Alleria found echoes of Umbric's journey scattered across the land, journals and messages left behind as he and his followers pursued their research. She learned of his motivations, his hopes that the void could be harnessed for the good of his people, his refusal to abandon his studies even when ordered to do so. In many ways, his story mirrored her own, an elf who had rejected the expectations of his society in pursuit of something he believed was greater. The trail led to Dawnstar Spire, where Umbric had discovered the work of Darkhan Drathir, a traitor to Quel'Thalas, who had aided the Scourge during the invasion. Darkhan had been studying a rift to a place called Telogris Rift, a shattered world that existed within the void itself. Umbric believed that this rift could be the key to understanding and controlling the shadow energies he sought. Alleria opened the portal and stepped through, finding herself on a world unlike any she had seen. Telogris Rift was not a planet in any conventional sense. It was the remnants of a world that had been consumed by the void, fragments of reality floating in an endless expanse of shadow, held together by forces that defied mortal understanding. Here, Umbric and his followers had established a base, pursuing their research in a place where they would not threaten anyone else. But they were not alone on Telogris Rift. Nether Prince Durzan, a powerful ethereal who had allied himself with the Void Lords, had discovered their presence and seen an opportunity. When Alleria arrived, she found Umbric and his followers in the process of being transformed, Durzan's ritual forcing void energy into them in an attempt to create servants for his masters. The battle was fierce, one of the hardest Alleria had fought since returning to Azeroth. Durzan was a being of considerable power, a Nether prince whose mastery of the void had been honed over millennia of study and practice. He was backed by void creatures that manifested from the shadows themselves, twisted entities that attacked with claws of darkness and mouths that whispered madness. And then there was Nurgesh, a monstrous entity of pure void energy, a manifestation of entropy and dissolution that seemed to be more absence than presence, a hole in reality that consumed everything it touched. But Alleria had spent 1,000 years fighting creatures far more terrible, and she had her own mastery of the void to draw upon. She matched Durzan shadow for shadow, countered his attacks with her own, used the whispers that he tried to weaponize against her as a source of power rather than weakness. The adventurer who had accompanied her proved invaluable, dealing with the lesser void creatures while Alleria focused on the greater threats. The battle raged across the fragmented platforms of Telogris Rift, the combatants leaping from island to island in a chase that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Alleria drew on everything Locus-Walker had taught her, every technique and principle that she had learned during her centuries of training. She would not lose, not here, not when so many elven lives hung in the balance. When Durzan finally fell, his form dissipating into the shadows from which it had been born, Alleria felt a moment of triumph, but the victory was incomplete. With the help of an adventurer from Azeroth who had accompanied her, she had defeated Durzan and freed Umbric's followers from his control. But the damage had already been done. The ritual had not been completely stopped. It had been interrupted, altered, but the transformation had still occurred. Umbric and his blood elves were no longer what they had been. They had become void elves, their very essence changed by the power that had been forced into them. Their skin had taken on shades of blue and purple, their hair bleached to silver or deepened to midnight, their eyes now windows into the shadow that lived within them. The transformation was profound and irreversible. Unlike Alleria, who had gradually absorbed void energy over centuries and had completed her transformation through a conscious choice to absorb Lura's essence, these elves had been changed against their will, the power forced into them by Durzan's dark ritual. They could not undo what had been done, could not return to what they had been. They were void elves now, for better or worse, and they would have to learn to live with what they had become. They called themselves the Ren'dorei, the children of the void, and they looked to Alleria as their leader. She was the first of their kind, the one who had shown that the void could be mastered rather than merely endured. She had saved them from becoming slaves, had given them a chance to choose their own destiny. In return, they pledged themselves to her service and to the cause she represented. Alleria accepted the responsibility. She would teach them as Locus-Walker had taught her, would help them learn to control their powers without being consumed by them. And she would give them a purpose, a cause worth fighting for. The Void Elves would join the Alliance, would stand alongside the humans and dwarves and night elves and all the other peoples who opposed the Horde and defended Azeroth from its enemies. The decision to join the Alliance was not made lightly. Many of Umbric's followers had once been Horde soldiers, had served Silvermoon and the Blood Elves during the various conflicts that had shaped the post-Sunwell era. They had friends and family still in Quel'Thalas, connections that would be severed if they allied with their former enemies. But the Horde had cast them out, had declared them too dangerous to remain among their own people. The Alliance, through Alleria, offered them acceptance, a place where their abilities would be valued rather than feared. There was also a practical consideration. The Void Elves needed training, needed guidance from someone who had mastered the powers they were still learning to control. Alleria could provide that guidance, but only if they were willing to follow her into the Alliance. She would not force them, made clear that the choice was theirs to make, but she also made clear that she would not abandon the faction she had served since the Second War to join the Horde, no matter how many of Umbric's followers wished she would. In the end, the Void Elves chose unity over division. They pledged themselves to Alleria and to the Alliance, accepting that this choice would permanently separate them from the Blood Elves they had once been. It was a new beginning, the birth of a new people with a new purpose, and Alleria was honored to lead them. Locus-Walker came to Telegris Rift as well, drawn by the concentration of void-touched beings in one place. The ethereal mentor saw an opportunity to continue his work, to shape a new generation of void wielders who would use their powers responsibly. He agreed to help Alleria train the Ren'dorei, to share the wisdom he had accumulated over eons of existence. Together, they established Telegris Rift as a haven for void elves, a place where they could study their powers without endangering others, where they could learn and grow and prepare for the challenges ahead. The training regimen that Alleria and Locus-Walker developed was rigorous and comprehensive. Void elves learned to control their transformations, to shift between their normal appearance and their void-infused forms at will. They learned to hear the whispers without being overwhelmed by them, to extract useful information from the chaos of possibilities that the void revealed. They learned to create portals, to summon tendrils of shadow energy, to sense the presence of corruption that others could not perceive. But the most important lesson was one of identity. The void would try to change them, would whisper that they should abandon their old selves and embrace the shadow completely. Alleria taught them to resist this temptation, to hold onto who they had been while accepting who they were becoming. They were not slaves of the void, not puppets whose strings were pulled by forces beyond their understanding. They were void elves, masters of the shadow, and they would use their powers according to their own will. The void elves became an allied race of the Alliance, their unique abilities making them valuable soldiers and spies in the conflicts to come. They could create portals through the void, could sense things hidden from normal perception, could tap into powers that made even the most seasoned warriors hesitate. Under Alleria's leadership, they proved that the shadow was not merely corruption, but could be a tool for good when properly controlled. The fragile peace that had followed the Legion's defeat did not last. The discovery of Azerite, the crystallized blood of Azeroth's world soul, sparked a new conflict between Alliance and Horde. Both factions sought to claim this powerful resource for themselves, and the tensions that had been simmering since the founding of the Horde finally boiled over into open war. It began with fire. Sylvanas Windrunner, now warchief of the Horde, ordered the burning of Teldrassil, the world tree that served as home to the Night Elves. The destruction was total, the casualties beyond counting, a war crime that shocked even those who had expected conflict. Alleria watched from afar as the tree burned, saw the smoke rising from what had been one of Azeroth's greatest wonders, and felt something within her harden. Teldrassil had been more than just a tree, even a world tree. It had been a home, a refuge, a symbol of everything the Night Elves had accomplished in the 10,000 years since the Sundering. Hundreds of thousands of Night Elves had lived among its branches, had built their lives in its shadow, had raised children, and grown old within the embrace of its ancient wood. And now they were all dead, burned alive by an order from Sylvanas Windrunner, the sister Alleria had once loved. The void whispers had grown louder in the days following Teldrassil's destruction, had become a constant chorus of validation for Alleria's darkest impulses. They reminded her of what they had shown her during the failed reunion at Windrunner Spire, the visions of futures where Sylvanas brought ruin to everything. They had been right, the whispers insisted. They had warned her, and she had not listened. If she had acted when she had the chance, If she had struck down the monster while she still could, all those night elves might still be alive. She did not give in to the whispers. She had learned better than that during her training with Locus-Walker, but she could not deny that they had a point. Sylvanas had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Whatever might once have been salvageable about their relationship was now burned away like the branches of Teldrassil. They were enemies now, in every sense that mattered, and Alleria would not hesitate when next they met. Her sister had done this. The Sylvanas who had once been a hero of Quel'Thalas, who had fought to protect the innocent, who had been devastated by Lirith's death because she could not bear to see her little brother come to harm, had ordered the massacre of thousands of civilians. The Void's whispers had been right about her. She was a monster now, and she had to be stopped. The Alliance's response was the battle for Lordaeron, an assault on the Undercity, the seat of Forsaken power. Alleria led the Void Elf contingent, her warriors appearing through portals at a critical moment in the battle, turning the tide when the Alliance forces seemed about to be overwhelmed. She fought alongside King Anduin Wrynn and Gen Greymane and Jaina Proudmoore, driving deeper into the city that had once been a human capital. When they finally cornered Sylvanas in the throne room of Lordaeron Keep, Alleria looked upon her sister with eyes that held no mercy. She regretted not having killed Sylvanas when they had last met, regretted giving her the chance to commit the atrocities that had followed. If she had listened to the Void's whispers, if she had struck down the monster while she had the chance, Teldrassil might still be standing. But Sylvanas was not cornered at all. The war chief had prepared for this moment, had known that the Alliance would eventually force their way into the heart of her power. She fled through a hole in the throne room's ceiling, and as she departed, the blight began to flood the city. Massive stores of the poisonous gas that the Forsaken used as a weapon had been placed throughout Lordaeron, and Sylvanas had detonated them as a final act of defiance. The Alliance forces barely escaped, teleported to safety by Jaina's magic as the throne room filled with deadly toxins. Lordaeron was lost, rendered uninhabitable by the blight that now saturated its stones. It was a victory and a defeat at once, the Alliance claiming the city but finding it worthless, poisoned beyond use. In the aftermath, Alleria declared her mission publicly. She would hunt Sylvanas. She would find her sister and make her pay for everything she had done. This was not vengeance for its own sake, as her crusade against the orcs had been. This was justice, necessary action against a war criminal who threatened everyone Alleria cared about. The war between Alliance and Horde continued, fought across Kultiras and Zandalar and the seas between them. Alleria served as a leader of the Alliance's intelligence operations, her void powers allowing her to gather information that others could not access. She trained more void elves, expanded the Ren'dorei presence in the Alliance's military structure, and waited for the opportunity to confront her sister again. That opportunity never came in the way she expected. Sylvanas's atrocities continued to mount, her actions growing increasingly erratic and destructive, until finally she was confronted not by Alleria, but by Saurfang, an orc who had once served her loyally. In the duel that followed, Sylvanas killed Saurfang, but in doing so revealed the truth about her allegiances. She had never truly cared about the Horde or its people. They were tools to be used and discarded, means to an end that had nothing to do with orcish honor or trollish pride or any of the values the Horde claimed to represent. She abandoned the Horde entirely, fleeing to pursue goals that only she understood, leaving behind a faction in chaos and a trail of destruction that spanned continents. Alleria watched her sister disappear, felt the void's whispers urge her to follow, and for once found herself in agreement with the shadow. Sylvanas could not be allowed to continue. Whatever she was planning, whatever end she sought, it had to be stopped. The hunt would continue, even if it took another 1,000 years. The truth about Sylvanas' actions was revealed during the events in the Shadowlands, the realm of death, where souls journeyed after their mortal lives ended. She had been working with the Jailer, a primordial entity who had been imprisoned for attempting to unmake the cosmic order, helping him break free of his chains and reshape reality according to his vision. The Jailer, whose true name was Zoval, had once been the arbiter of the Shadowlands, the being responsible for judging all souls and sending them to their appropriate afterlives. But he had been corrupted by a vision of a universe without free will, a cosmos ordered according to his perfect design. The other Eternal Ones had stripped him of his power and imprisoned him in the Maw, a place of endless torment reserved for the most irredeemable souls. Sylvanas had become his instrument. Whether by choice or manipulation was a matter of debate. She had orchestrated the war between Alliance and Horde, had caused countless deaths that fed the Maw's power, had shattered the barrier between the living world and the Shadowlands. All of it had been in service to the Jailer's plan, a plan that would have ended free will across all of existence if it had succeeded. Alleria could not enter the Shadowlands herself. The realm of death had its own rules, its own barriers, and her void-touched nature made crossing over difficult, if not impossible. The void and death were both cosmic forces, but they did not mix well, their energies interfering with each other in ways that made travel between realms hazardous. Alleria remained on Azeroth, coordinating what efforts she could from the living side, waiting for news from those who had ventured into the afterlife. But she watched from Azeroth as champions ventured into the afterlife, as they confronted the Jailer and his allies, as they finally brought Sylvanas to account for her crimes. She received reports of battles in realms beyond imagination, of covenants and eternal ones, and a conflict that threatened to reshape the fundamental nature of death itself. She heard how Sylvanas had eventually turned against the Jailer, how she had helped defeat him when she realized that his vision would not save the souls she thought she was protecting, but would instead doom them all. The news that reached her was complicated. Sylvanas had been reunited with a portion of her soul that had been torn away when she first died, a fragment of who she had been that the Jailer had kept as leverage. With this piece restored, she was no longer the cold and calculating monster who had burned Teldrassil. She was something else, something in between, a being who remembered what she had done with the full weight of conscience that had been denied her. The moral implications were staggering. If Sylvanas had been acting without the full capacity to understand the wrongness of her actions, could she be held fully accountable for them? If the Jailer had stolen a piece of her soul that contained her ability to feel guilt and empathy, was the creature who burned Teldrassil truly Sylvanas, or was it something else wearing her face? These were questions that philosophers and theologians would debate for centuries, and Alleria was not sure she had answers to them when Tyrande Whisperwind pronounced judgment on Sylvanas, sentencing her to scour the maw until every soul trapped there had been freed. Alleria was there to witness it. The Night Warrior, avatar of Elune's darkest aspect, had every right to demand death for what Sylvanas had done to her people. The burning of Teldrassil had been an act of genocide, a crime so vast that no punishment could truly match its horror. And yet, Tyrande chose mercy, perhaps recognizing that some crimes were too great for simple execution to address, that Sylvanas needed to actively atone for what she had done rather than simply cease to exist. Alleria stood with Verisa in the Ring of Transference in Oribos, watching as their sister accepted her fate and jumped into the endless prison that awaited her. The Maw was not merely a place of confinement, but a realm of active torment, where souls suffered eternally for the sins they had committed in life. Sylvanas would spend eons there, freeing souls one by one, experiencing their pain as her own. It was a punishment that fit the crime, forcing her to undo the damage she had caused one small piece at a time. It was a brief reunion, the three sisters together for only moments before duty separated them again. They did not embrace. They did not share the words that siblings might share after years of estrangement. There was too much between them for that, too many wounds that could not be healed by simple reconciliation. But they were there, together, in the same place at the same time, and that alone felt like a miracle after everything that had happened. Sylvanas looked at Alleria with eyes that held something they had not held in decades, perhaps centuries. Regret, perhaps. Sorrow. The ghost of the love that had once bound them together, before death and undeath and 1,000 years of separation had torn everything apart. For a moment, Alleria could see the sister she had known in that face, could see the fierce ranger who had inherited their mother's title and protected Quel'Thalas with everything she had. That sister was still in there somewhere, buried under layers of trauma and darkness, waiting to be found again. Alleria found herself speaking words she had not expected to say. She had ceased hoping for such a thing, she admitted to Verisa. She was pleased they had a chance to speak with Sylvanas, even if that chance was so brief. The whispers that had demanded Sylvanas's death were quieter now, as if even the void recognized that the sister she had known might still exist somewhere within the Banshee Queen. Verisa lamented that they had not had more time, but there would be time eventually. Sylvanas had a penance to complete, souls to save from the torment of the Maw, but when that work was done, perhaps they could be a family again. It was more hope than Alleria had allowed herself in years, and she held on to it as she returned to Azeroth, to the duties that awaited her there. The void had never truly been silent, but in the years that followed the Legion's defeat and the war against Sylvanas, the whispers had grown louder. They spoke of something coming, a darkness greater than any Alleria had faced, a threat that made even the burning Legion seem like a minor inconvenience. She had learned to listen to the whispers without obeying them, to extract useful information from the chaos of possibilities they presented, and what she heard now filled her with dread. During the interval between major conflicts, Alleria had not been idle. She had continued to train the Void Elves of Telagris Rift, helping them master their powers and resist the corruption that constantly threatened to consume them. She had worked with Alliance intelligence operations, using her unique abilities to gather information that others could not access. And she had spent time with her family, trying to rebuild relationships that had been strained by centuries of absence and the complications of her transformation. Her relationship with Turalyon remained strong, though it too had faced challenges. He was now the High Exarch of the Army of the Light, a position of tremendous responsibility that kept him busy with the affairs of the Draenor and their ongoing vigilance against future demonic threats. She was the leader of the Void Elves, a people whose very existence was viewed with suspicion by many who served the light. They had spent 1,000 years fighting side by side, and now they sometimes found themselves on opposite sides of philosophical debates about the nature of cosmic forces. But love endured what philosophy could not destroy. They made time for each other despite their duties, found moments of peace amid the chaos of their responsibilities. Alleria would visit him on the Vindicar when she could, and he would come to her in Telegris Rift, though the void energies of that place made him uncomfortable in ways he tried to hide. Their love was not simple, but it was real, and it anchored them both when the darkness threatened to overwhelm. Her relationship with Eretor had also grown during this time. The awkwardness of their initial reunion had faded, replaced by something approaching genuine familiarity. She learned about the man her son had become, his dedication to the light, his courage in battle, his struggles with the legacy he had inherited. He learned about the mother who had left him, the ranger who had become a champion, the woman who carried the void within her and used it to protect those she loved. The Harbinger was coming. That was what the Whispers called her, the one who would herald the Void Lord's ultimate victory, the servant who would deliver Azeroth into the Shadow's embrace. Alleria had dealt with void-corrupted beings before, had fought the Shadow Guard and other groups who had surrendered themselves to the darkness. But this was different. This was something old and powerful, something that had been planning its return for eons. The first signs appeared in visions that many across Azeroth experienced, radiant dreams that seemed to promise hope but carried an undercurrent of wrongness that those sensitive to such things could feel. Alleria recognized them immediately. Locus-Walker had warned her about such visions, had told her that his own people had experienced something similar before their world was consumed by the Void Lord Dimensius. The light that people saw was not salvation, but bait, a lure designed to draw the unsuspecting into the darkness. When Magni Bronzebeard, the speaker for Azeroth, revealed that the World Soul herself had warned him of dark forces gathering on Kaz Algar, Alleria knew that the time for preparation was over. Whatever was coming was almost here, and she would have to be ready to face it. The investigation led to Dalaran, the floating city of mages that had served as a neutral refuge for so long. Something was wrong there, a presence that did not belong, a darkness hiding within the city's magical wards. Alleria probed with her void senses, trying to identify the threat, and what she found chilled her to the core. Xal'atath had infiltrated Dalaran. The Harbinger, the one the Whispers had warned her about, was already inside the city's defenses, preparing for an assault that would destroy one of Azeroth's greatest repositories of magical knowledge. Alleria tried to warn the others, tried to mount a defense, but she was too late. The assault came with devastating suddenness. Xal'atath revealed herself and unleashed her forces, attacking Dalaran from within, while her armies struck from without. The mages fought back with everything they had, but they were facing a being of immense power, one who had been planning this moment for longer than most of them had been alive. Dalaran fell, the city crashing from the sky in flames, and countless lives were lost in the destruction. Alleria survived because the Void had prepared her for this moment, because her mastery of shadow allowed her to escape through rifts that others could not perceive. But survival felt hollow when so much had been lost, when the enemy she had been hunting had struck so terrible a blow and then vanished before she could respond. The war had truly begun now, a conflict that would make everything before it seem like mere prologue. Xal'atath led the Nerubians of Azji-Kahet, the ancient spider-like civilization that dwelt beneath Azeroth's surface, in a campaign to claim the world soul for the Void. Her goal was nothing less than the corruption of Azeroth itself, the transformation of the planet's unborn Titan soul into a servant of the Void Lords. Alleria pursued her across Khaz-Algar, fighting through Nerubian armies and Void horrors to reach the truth about what Xal'atath truly was. The Harbinger was not simply a servant of the Void, as Alleria had initially assumed. She was something older, a survivor from the Black Empire that had ruled Azeroth before the Titans came, a being whose history stretched back to the age of the old gods themselves. Learning about Xal'atath's nature led Alleria to her own past, to Locus-Walker and the secrets he had kept from her. Her mentor had his own history with the darkness, his own role in the destruction of Kaiarish, the ethereal homeworld. He had been there when Dimensius came, had made choices that contributed to his people's doom. The wisdom he had shared with Alleria was real, but it was also incomplete, shaped by guilt and regret that he had never fully admitted. The revelation shook Alleria to her core. She had trusted Locus-Walker completely, had believed that he was giving her all the knowledge she needed to master the Void. To learn that he had been hiding truths from her, that his teachings had been colored by his own guilt and shame, made her question everything she thought she knew. How much of what he had taught her was genuine wisdom, and how much was the self-justification of a being who could not face the consequences of his own actions. But there was no time for philosophical introspection. The threat was immediate and existential. Xal'atath was moving forward with her plans, and if she succeeded, Azeroth would share the fate of Karish and countless other worlds that the Void had consumed. Alleria would have to use the tools that she had been given, regardless of the flaws in the hands that had shaped them, and hope that her own will would be enough to overcome whatever deficiencies existed in her training. On Ka'arish itself, in what remained of that shattered world, Alleria and her allies confronted Dimensius directly. The journey there had been harrowing, a passage through realms of corruption that would have driven most mortals mad within moments of exposure. Alleria felt the Void pressing against her consciousness, the whispers becoming screams, the temptation to surrender almost overwhelming. But she had spent centuries learning to resist this pressure, and she held firm. The Void Lord who had consumed an entire civilization was a being of unfathomable power, an entity that existed on a scale that mortals could barely comprehend. Dimensius was not simply a creature or a god. He was a force of nature, an embodiment of entropy and dissolution, the hunger at the heart of the shadow, given form and purpose. Looking upon him was like staring into the end of all things, a vision of the universe reduced to nothing but emptiness and void. But Alleria had spent 1,000 years fighting impossible odds, had mastered powers that should have driven her mad, and she did not falter. She had faced the Burning Legion, had fought demons that consumed worlds for pleasure, had stood against Sargeras himself during the final battle on Argus. Dimensius was terrible, but he was not the first terrible thing she had confronted, and she would not let fear paralyze her now. With Locus-Walker's guidance and the help of champions from Azeroth, they managed to imprison Dimensius within the Dark Heart, an artifact that Xal'atath had been using to channel void energy. It was a victory, a genuine triumph against one of the most terrifying beings in existence. For a moment, it seemed like the tide might be turning. Then Xal'atath betrayed them. She had been waiting for this moment, for the Dark Heart to be empowered by Dimensius's essence, for all the pieces to fall into place for her true plan. She killed Locus-Walker, struck down the mentor who had taught Alleria everything she knew about the Void, and claimed the Dark Heart's power for herself. Alleria held her teacher as he died, watched the light fade from the ethereal's form, felt the loss of someone who had become more than a mentor over the centuries they had known each other. Locus-Walker had made mistakes, had hidden truths that might have been helpful, but he had also saved her life and her sanity more times than she could count. He deserved better than to die at the hands of the very darkness he had spent his existence fighting. She swore an oath over his body. She would hunt Xal'atath to the ends of the universe and beyond. She would avenge her teacher's death and prevent the Harbinger from completing whatever dark plan she had set in motion. The Void Whispers screamed in approval, and for once, Alleria was grateful for their bloodlust. The war continues. Xal'atath has formed the Devouring Host, a vast army of void creatures that threatens to consume everything in its path. Her forces have attacked the Isle of Quel'Thalas, seeking to corrupt the Sunwell and use its power for the Void's purposes. Silvermoon itself is in danger, the homeland that Alleria was exiled from now, facing destruction at the hands of an enemy she has sworn to stop. Eretor asked his mother to join him and Verisa in defending Silvermoon, to stand with family against the darkness that threatens to consume everything they hold dear. It is a tempting offer, a chance to fight alongside her son and sister, to reclaim her place in the land of her birth, even if only for a moment. But Alleria cannot turn aside from her hunt. Xal'atath is too dangerous to be left unchallenged, too powerful to be allowed time to consolidate her gains. Someone has to pursue the Harbinger, to keep pressure on her forces, to prevent her from achieving her ultimate goals. And Alleria Windrunner, eldest of the Windrunner sisters, leader of the Void Elves, master of the Shadow, is the only one who can do it. The story of Alleria Windrunner is one of transformation and persistence, of a woman who refused to be defined by the expectations placed upon her, and instead forged her own path through the darkness. She was born to be a ranger general, destined to spend her immortal life patrolling the borders of Quel'Thalas, and instead she became something no one could have predicted. Throughout her long life, Alleria has worn many titles and served many roles. She was a ranger of Quel'Thalas, one of the Farstriders who protected the kingdom from external threats. She was a scout for the alliance of Lord Aeron, using her elven skills to gather intelligence during the Second War. She was a member of the Sons of Lothar, the expedition that pursued the Horde to Draenor and sacrificed everything to prevent further invasions. She was a soldier of the Army of the Light, fighting against the Burning Legion for 1,000 years across countless worlds. She was the first Void Elf, the one who proved that the shadow could be mastered. And now she is a huntress once more, pursuing Xal'atath across the universe. Each of these roles has required different skills and different sacrifices. As a ranger, she learned patience and precision, the ability to wait in silence for the perfect moment to strike. As a scout, she learned to read terrain and interpret the movements of enemy forces. As an expedition member, she learned to fight in unfamiliar territory against overwhelming odds. As a soldier of the light, she learned that wars could last longer than civilizations, that victory might never come, but the fight had to continue anyway. As a void elf, she learned that darkness could be a tool rather than a corruption. And as a huntress, she learned that some prey required more than skill to catch, requiring an understanding of their nature that came only from becoming something like them. The thread that connects all these roles is her refusal to accept limitations. When Quel'Thalas told her that the world beyond the kingdom's borders was not worth exploring, she explored it anyway. When the Second War told her that vengeance was the only response to loss, she learned to love again, even while continuing to fight. When Draenor's destruction told her that she would never see her son again, she survived and eventually returned. When the Void told her that she must succumb to its whispers, she mastered them instead. When Zera told her that light and shadow could not coexist, she proved her wrong. Alleria has spent her entire life being told what she cannot do, and she has spent that same life proving those pronouncements false. She is a daughter of the High Elves who was exiled from her homeland. She is a mother who missed decades of her son's life and returned to find him a hero in his own right. She is a sister whose family was shattered by tragedy and has never fully healed. She is a lover who stood beside the same man for 1,000 years and still finds new reasons to love him. She is a warrior who has fought in more battles than she can count and shows no signs of stopping. Most remarkably, she is a being of the void who has not lost herself to its corruption. The whispers that have driven others to madness are her constant companions, but they do not control her. She has taken the darkness that was forced upon her and transformed it into a weapon against those who would use it for destruction. She is proof that the void does not have to mean corruption, that the shadow can be wielded by those with the will to master it. The Windrunner legacy is a complicated one. 3 sisters who should have been united by blood and history have instead been torn apart by death and undeath and the cosmic forces that play with mortal lives like pieces on a game board. Alleria chose to leave, Sylvanas chose to embrace darkness, and Varisa chose to endure. Each path has led to tragedy and triumph in equal measure. The tragedy of the Windrunner sisters is that each of them, in her own way, was trying to do what she thought was right. Alleria left Quel'Thalas because she believed that isolation was weakening her people, that the world beyond the kingdom's borders offered opportunities that could not be found within. Sylvanas embraced the darkness, because she believed it was the only way to protect herself and those she cared about from the horrors she had experienced. Varisa stayed true to the Alliance and the High Elven traditions because she believed that consistency and loyalty were virtues worth preserving, even when the world seemed to demand otherwise. None of them was entirely wrong, and none of them was entirely right. Alleria's wanderlust led her to love and adventure, but it also led her away from her family during some of the most difficult times of their lives. Sylvanas' ruthlessness helped her survive the unimaginable, but it also led her to commit atrocities that can never be fully forgiven. Varisa's steadfastness gave her a stable foundation, but it also meant that she was often caught between sisters whose paths had diverged too far to be easily reconciled. But there is hope. Sylvanas is working to redeem herself in the depths of the maw, freeing souls that the jailer had imprisoned. It is a sentence that will take eons to complete, perhaps longer, but at least it is something, a recognition that the wrongs she has committed cannot simply be forgotten, but must be actively addressed. Varisa continues to lead the Silver Covenant and protect what remains of the High Elven legacy, ensuring that some part of their people's culture and tradition will survive regardless of what happens to their scattered nation. And Alleria fights on, using powers that should have consumed her to protect the world that birthed her. The Windrunner story is not over. It may never be over, not while any of them still draw breath or its equivalent. Perhaps one day, when Sylvanas' penance is complete and the threat of the void has been neutralized and the world has found a moment of peace, the three sisters will be able to stand together again. They will never be the children they once were, playing in the golden forests of Eversong Woods, dreaming of futures that none of them would actually experience. But they might be sisters again, connected by blood and by history and by the love that has never entirely disappeared. No matter how many centuries and conflicts have tried to destroy it. Statues stand in Alleria's honor in the Valley of Heroes, carved from stone that cannot capture the fire in her eyes or the determination in her heart. The statue in Stormwind depicts her in her ranger garb, bow drawn, eyes fixed on some distant enemy that only she can see. It was erected alongside statues of the other heroes of the Sons of Lothar, a monument to those who gave everything to protect Azeroth from the Horde. For decades, people believed she was dead. Now they know the truth, and the statue has become a place of pilgrimage for those who admire her sacrifice and her strength. Coins bearing her likeness circulate through Dalaran's markets, wishes inscribed on their surfaces that speak to the love people have for this hero who sacrificed so much. The coin of many faces, as it is sometimes called, shows Alleria on one side, bow raised, ready for battle. On the other side is an inscription that reads, simply, "May the shadows guide you." It is a blessing and a warning, a recognition of the path she has chosen and the power she wields. Those who carry the coin believe it brings luck in battle and protection against the darkness. 2 realms in the world of Warcraft are named after her. Alleria's server was one of the original servers launched with the game, a testament to her importance in Warcraft lore even before her character was expanded in later expansions. Her name has become synonymous with courage, with sacrifice, with the refusal to surrender no matter how impossible the odds. She is a legend, not just in the game's story, but in the hearts of the players who have followed her journey through decades of adventures. She is the Void Huntress, the Shadow Ranger, the first of the Void Elves, and the leader of the Ren'dorei. She is a mother and a sister and a lover. She is a soldier who has never stopped fighting and never will, not while threats remain to the world she has sworn to protect. She is Alleria Windrunner, and her story continues. What the future holds for Alleria remains uncertain. The war against Xal'atath is still ongoing, the threat of the Void far from neutralized. Silvermoon faces danger from the devouring host, and Alleria must choose between reuniting with her family to defend her homeland and pursuing the Harbinger to prevent even greater catastrophe. It is the kind of choice she has faced before, the tension between personal connection and cosmic duty that has defined her entire life. But if history is any guide, Alleria will find a way to do both. She has spent 1,000 years learning that impossible choices can be survived, that seemingly irreconcilable duties can sometimes be reconciled through determination and creativity. She will hunt Xal'atath, and she will protect those she loves, and she will master the Void without becoming its slave. That is who Alleria Windrunner is, and that is who she will always be. For players who wish to experience Alleria's story firsthand, there are many places in World of Warcraft where her presence can be felt. In the Valley of Heroes at Stormwind's entrance, her statue stands alongside those of the other sons of Lothar, commemorating the heroes who ventured to Draenor and were presumed lost. In Legion content, she appears on Argus as part of the Army of the Light, her mastery of the Void on full display as she aids in the final assault against the Burning Legion. In battle for Azeroth, she leads the Void Elf allied race through their introduction questline and participates in key alliance moments throughout the expansion. And in the War Within, she takes center stage as one of the primary characters confronting the threat of Xal'atath and the Void. Her journey from High Elven Ranger to Void-touched hero is one of the longest and most complex in all of Warcraft lore. She has witnessed the rise and fall of the Horde, the destruction of her homeland, the corruption and redemption of her sister, and the war against cosmic forces that threaten all of existence. Through it all, she has remained true to herself, adapting to circumstances that would have broken lesser beings, finding new purposes when old ones were fulfilled or lost. She is a survivor in the truest sense, someone who has endured horrors beyond imagining and emerged not just intact, but stronger. The necklace her mother gave her, with its 3 gems representing the 3 sisters, likely still hangs around her neck somewhere, a reminder of the family she once had and might have again. Larissa Windrunner gave that necklace to her eldest daughter on the day Alleria left Quel'Thalas, a farewell gift that was also a reminder of the bonds that could never truly be broken, no matter how far Alleria wandered. The green of the emerald for Alleria, who wandered the world seeking what lay beyond familiar borders, who refused to accept the destiny that had been prepared for her and instead created her own. The red of the ruby for Sylvanas, whose heart burned with passion that eventually consumed her, whose journey from hero to villain to penitent is one of the most tragic in all of Warcraft lore. The blue of the sapphire for Verisa, whose constancy has never wavered through all the trials their family has faced, who has held on to hope when her sisters had let it go. 3 gems, 3 sisters, 3 paths through a world that has been cruel to all of them, but has not managed to destroy any of them. That is the complete story of Alleria Windrunner. If you enjoyed it, give it a like and subscribe. We tell the full stories of all of Warcraft's greatest characters right here on World of Sleepcraft.